Another one of my favorite directors behind Martin Scorsese and Steven Spielberg is Roman Polanski. Now, before you attack me in the comments section, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, I am aware of what he did in 1977, and yes, what he did was completely 100% wrong, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here to talk about his work, nothing more. Let's be honest. The guy is a really good filmmaker. He's dabbled in genres from costume dramas, suspense thrillers, occult horror films, psychological horror films, comedies, film noir, and a story about the worst atrocity ever committed by man, the Holocaust. So, with your permission, allow me to reveal to you 12 of my favorite films made by this controversial European filmmaker. This is my top 12 favorite Roman Polanski films. Number 12. The Fearless Vampire Killers, aka Dance of the Vampires. Long before Mel Brooks made Dracula Dead and Loving It, Roman Polanski decided to make a spoof of the vampire films that were coming out at the time. The film involves an elderly professor and his dim-witted sidekick on the hunt for vampires in the heart of Transylvania. This was Roman Polanski's first film to be shot in color, and is beautifully photographed by Douglas Slocum, best known as the cinematographer for the first 3 Indiana Jones films. There's also a great deal of artificiality in the production design, but that was done on purpose, because that's how the old Hammer Dracula films were made, and Polanski wanted to emulate those films. Now, what has to be pointed out about this film was that Polanski had final cut in Europe, but in America, it was executive producer Martin Reznov who had control, and he inadvertently cut 9 minutes out, redubbed voices of certain characters, and changed the film's title from Dance of the Vampires to The Fearless Vampire Killers, or, pardon me, but your teeth are in my neck. I guess they wanted to make another Dr. Strangelove. And as if to add insult to injury, he slapped on this god-awful animated prologue that looked like something out of Rocky and Bullwinkle. It was then shown to American audiences, and guess what? They hated it. But lucky for us, the cut that Polanski himself has approved has been on all the DVDs and Blu-rays. Now, the film has a good deal of sight gags, one-liners, pratfalls, and a lot of silly stuff, so if you don't have a taste for slapstick, this might not be the film for you. But if you're in the mood to see a silly movie with some vampires, give this a watch.
You got the wrong vampire!
Number 11. Death and the Maiden. Based on the play by Ariel Dorfman, it tells the story of a political activist, played by Sigourney Weaver, who is convinced that her guest was involved in her brutal torture and rape during the 1970s under a fascist regime in South America. So she holds him at gunpoint and performs a mock trial in order to extract a confession.
I've got him, Gerardo, and he's the one I wanted, the worst of them. The others were just thugs. I expected them, but he was a doctor, supposedly there to make sure they didn't kill me. He talked about science and philosophy. He liked to quote Nietzsche.
What I truly love about this film is that it's only these 3 characters and in one location. The setup is also unnerving because you don't know where this is going to go and if he's going to cooperate with her or if he's going to keep denying everything just to save his own skin.
I don't know you. I've never seen you before in my life. I don't know what it is you think I've done. Obviously, she's insane. She's not responsible for what she does, but you're a lawyer. If you don't stop this right now, you're an accomplice. You're gonna have to pay the price.
Sigourney Weaver manages to pull off a really stellar performance, and it's unlike anything I've seen from her. She can be very moving at times, but can also be slightly unpredictable. I also liked Stuart Wilson as the husband because he seems to be the only one who is rational-minded.
Do you realize what you've done?
Yes, darling, absolutely.
This is kidnapping. This is assault. We're gonna go to jail for 20 years.
The movie deals with the themes that Polanski is well acquainted with: guilt, retribution, and forgiveness for horrendous acts. Is Ben Kingsley's character who she says he is, or is she a paranoid woman obsessed with revenge? Give it a watch, and you'll be amazed at the final result.
What if he's innocent?
If he's innocent, then he's really fucked.
Number 10. Repulsion. Roman Polanski's second feature and his first English-speaking film, Repulsion tells the story of a manicurist, played by the sexy Catherine Deneuve, who is left alone in her apartment while her sister goes on vacation. Slowly, she begins to hallucinate traumas from her past, ultimately leading her to murder. The film is the first in what is to be known as Polanski's apartment trilogy, starting with this film, Rosemary's Baby, and The Tenant, in which you have a horror film that takes place primarily in an apartment complex. The movie is beautifully photographed by Gilbert Taylor. Polanski hired him after seeing his work on Dr. Strangelove. The black and white photography adds a very creepy feeling to the film, and Polanski manages to emulate filmmakers such as Buñuel, Cocteau, and Hitchcock. That image of hands coming out of the walls, cracks appearing in the walls, the claustrophobic feeling of the environment, those are images that stay with you long after the credits roll. With amazing visuals and performances, Repulsion is an unnerving and nail-biting exploration of a warped mind. Number 9. The Tenant. Based on the Roland Topper book, The Tenant is the third installment to Polanski's apartment trilogy. The story involves a Polish man, played by Polanski himself, renting out an apartment in Paris, and through the course of the film, he slowly begins to descend into paranoia. Much like Repulsion, The Tenant includes the theme of a main character descending into madness, and we, the viewer, can't distinguish what is real and what isn't. There's a good handful of people who hated this movie because of its twisted execution. Polanski himself has called the film a flawed but interesting experiment. Yet I can see so much of what other filmmakers such as Darren Aronofsky or Wes Craven would use in some of their films. It features probably one of the most enigmatic scenes of Polanski pulling a tooth out of a hole in the wall. Much like Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, the viewer can't separate what is actually happening and what is happening in the mind of the main character. And to be honest, I find that to be very terrifying. The Tenant, a psychological horror film showing us an example of alienation and urban paranoia taken to the max. Number 8. The Ghostwriter. Based on Robert Harris's book, The Ghost, it tells the story of an unnamed ghostwriter hired to complete the memoirs of a former British Prime Minister. Over the course of his research, he discovers hidden secrets that puts his own life in jeopardy. First and foremost, this film is a political thriller that was so relevant in what was going on in the world where politicians were accused of being war criminals. But the film plays it out like a Hitchcock film, where you have an ordinary man being thrust into extraordinary circumstances that might get himself killed. The film features a stellar cast, headed by Ewan McGregor and Pierce Brosnan. It's such an engaging story with so many twists and turns, and you feel for our unnamed main character, and we want to see him get out of what predicament he gets himself into. Polanski does what he does best when handling stories with gripping suspense. He instills a sense of dread right down to the various camera angles and including his sets. It's one of Polanski's best thrillers. Number 7. The Ninth Gate.
Are you a religious man, Mr. Corso? I mean, do you believe in the supernatural?
I believe in my percentage.
Like The Tenant, The Ninth Gate is one of those movies most people hated, and only a handful of them liked, but it really depends on what you're looking for in a satanic thriller. But anyway, the plot involves a book collector, played by Johnny Depp, who is sent on a mission to track down the last 2 remaining copies of a 3-part volume called The Nine Gates of the Kingdom of Shadows, a book that is said to have been co-authored by Satan.
If all 3 copies turn out to be bogus or incomplete, your work will be done. If, on the other hand, one of them turns out to be genuine, I'll finance you further. I want you to get it for me. At all costs. Never mind how.
Never mind how sounds illegal.
Wouldn't be the first time you've done something illegal.
Not that illegal.
Hence the size of the check.
Throughout the course of the film, Polanski manages to sustain every frame with the sense of uneasiness and dread that permeates a good deal of his suspense thrillers. But at the same time, Polanski injects a bit of black comedy. Some of the on-screen deaths are kind of laughable, and there's even a moment where characters within the film point out the absurdities of satanic covens. Most people hated this approach, but one must remember that Polanski is a stern atheist and doesn't have a strong belief in the supernatural, despite being fascinated on the subject. And to be fully honest, I find that to be very creative, and unlike most filmmakers who go over the top with satanic imagery and going so far as showing human sacrifices or Gregorian chants of unholy sayings, Polanski just looks at the images and points out how absurd the concept is. Johnny Depp is obviously brilliant in the role. Frank Langella is such an intriguing villain. The sets are gorgeous and the cinematography is pretty haunting, as well as the score. So if you manage to come across this film, it's important not to take everything what you see seriously. It's meant to be devilish fun. Number 6. Frantic. Released in 1988, Frantic is the story of an American surgeon, played by Harrison Ford, who discovers that his wife has mysteriously disappeared from his Paris hotel room. Eventually, he becomes swept up in a world of intrigue, espionage, and murder. This is Polanski's tribute to the films of Alfred Hitchcock. Here you have an ordinary man, through no fault of his own, becoming involved in an extraordinary circumstance. Harrison Ford is the kind of actor you root for. It's always interesting to see him get caught up in a plot that he knows very little about, and relying on his wits to get himself out of any trouble. In addition, you have the erotic Emanuelle Seigner, a woman who would eventually become Mrs. Roman Polanski. With nail-biting suspense and amazing set pieces, Frantic is a loving tribute to the master of suspense.
Don't mess with me, man. I am an American and I am crazy.
Number 5. Macbeth. Polanski's first film following the brutal murder of his second wife, actress Sharon Tate. Macbeth is a bloody and dirty telling of Shakespeare's play about a Scottish lord becoming king through treachery and murder.
Away! Ring the alarm bell! Murder and treason!
Now, I mentioned this movie in my triple Shakespeare movie review, and placed this film alongside Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet and Branagh's Hamlet as one of my favorite film adaptations of Shakespeare's work. One thing that this film manages to do is to make some of the soliloquies inner monologues.
Cursed be that tongue that tells me so, for it hath cowed my better part of man. And be these juggling fiends no more believed that palter with us in a double sense, that keep the word of promise to our ear and break it to our hope.
Also, the photography gives some of the scenes the appearance of living medieval work, such as this scene with the witches at the cauldron. It almost brings to mind the paintings done by Hieronymus Bosch. I don't know if Polanski intended that, but that's what I got from it. John Finch does a pretty spectacular job with the material. He could be sympathetic at times, but also treacherous at times. Despite being named Movie of the Year by the National Board of Review, Macbeth bombed at the box office. Most were put off by the excessive violence, but somehow it's a brilliant adaptation of Shakespeare's darkest of all his work.
My name's Macbeth.
Number 4. Carnage. Based on Yasmina Rez's play God of Carnage, the film is a story of two married couples whose children got into a physical altercation and one is left severely injured. Both couples come together to discuss the situation in a civilized manner, but as the evening goes on, the couples become increasingly childish to the point where they end up screaming at each other. Like Death and the Maiden, Carnage is just a small group of people in one location talking to each other, and it slowly falls apart and both parents are arguing with each other over the smallest things. You have 4 amazing actors, or as I describe it, 3 Oscar winners and a nominee. It's always fun to watch a bunch of grown-ups behaving like children. All I could say about Carnage is that it's a funny, intriguing, and just enjoyable experience about how even the most civilized people can be uncivilized for a very strange reason. Number 3. Rosemary's Baby. Based on the book by Ira Levin, it tells the story of a married couple moving into a new apartment, only to be surrounded by a group of neighbors who turn out to be Satanists. When she becomes pregnant, she becomes paranoid about the safety of her unborn child. This was Roman Polanski's first Hollywood film. Now, what Polanski does so well with the material is that he infuses the supernatural with the real world and makes it believable. This is a technique that was used later on to great perfection in Richard Donner's The Omen decades later. Everything that happens in it can be interpreted both by supernatural means, or is it all in Rosemary's mind, and that she is paranoid into thinking that her neighbors are really devil worshippers. In addition to the outstanding performance by Mia Farrow, is the incredible Academy Award-winning performance by Ruth Gordon. Every line in the film is taken directly from the book, and somehow she manages to make it sound like she's making up the dialogue. With haunting music, strange visuals, and stellar acting, Rosemary's Baby is considered one of the greatest psychological horror films of all time.
This is no dream. This is really happening.
Number 2. Chinatown. Nominated for 11 Academy Awards and winning only for original screenplay by Robert Towne, Chinatown is a film done in the style of film noir. It tells the story of private investigator Jake J. Gittes, played by Jack Nicholson, who has been hired to expose an adulterous woman played by Faye Dunaway, only to become involved in a web of deceit, corruption, and murder.
But in case you're interested, your husband was murdered. Somebody's been dumping thousands of tons of water from the city's reservoirs, and we're supposed to be in the middle of a drought. He found out about it, and he was killed.
Chinatown has been regarded as one of the greatest movies of all time. It really captures the feeling of old 1940s detective stories, where you have a character that's somehow relatable, and is always hell-bent on finding out the truth behind the veil of deception. The cast is so top-notch. Nicholson is brilliant as always. Faye Dunaway really captures that look of a classy femme fatale.
I don't get tough with anyone, Mr. Gidders. My lawyer does.
John Huston as the despicable water tycoon Noah Cross.
See, Mr. Gibbs, most people never have to face the fact. At the right time and the right place, they're capable of anything.
Even Roman Polanski makes an appearance.
You're a very nosy fellow, kitty cat, huh? You know what happens to nosy fellows? Huh? No? Wanna guess? Huh? No? Okay. They lose their noses.
The screenwriting is so brilliantly conceived and easy to follow, and Polanski adds his touch of including gripping suspense. Chinatown, a movie we'll never forget.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
And my number one favorite Roman Polanski film is The Pianist. This film is undoubtedly Polanski's best work by far. Why, you might ask? Because Polanski lived through it. The story of The Pianist is about a Polish piano player named Władysław Szpilman, played by Adrian Brody. Once the Nazis invade his homeland in Poland, he is soon separated from his family and must struggle to survive the Holocaust. It was always destined that Roman Polanski would make a film about the Holocaust. At one point, Steven Spielberg offered Polanski to direct Schindler's List, but he turned it down, feeling that the story was too personal, seeing as how he survived along with his father in the Krakow ghetto, which was depicted in Schindler's List. Polanski's mother was one of the 6 million victims who were murdered in the Holocaust. When Polanski decided to make The Pianist, he managed to incorporate memories that he experienced in his life, such as the image of people starving to death in the streets, a woman being shot for questioning, the father being struck by a German officer, and so many other moments. It is true that Polanski manages to stay as close to the book as possible, but somehow infuses the story with so much detail. One scene in the film that always stuck with me is the moment when the German soldiers storm an apartment in the Warsaw ghetto.
Aufstehen! Du, aufstehen! Hoch! Werft ihn raus!
What Polanski does so brilliantly is that he captures what we see through the point of view of the characters. Any other director would have set up multiple cameras or showed the action in various angles, but Polanski keeps it from the main character's point of view. The movie was released in 2002 and was a critical and commercial success. At the Academy Awards, Adrian Brody took home Best Actor, Ronald Harwood took home the Oscar for Adapted Screenplay, and then this unexpected surprise.
And the Oscar goes to Roman Polanski for The Pianist.
Roman Polanski was quoted to say, "I think if cans of my films should be put on my grave, I would like them all to be The Pianist." That I wholeheartedly agree. The Pianist, my number one favorite Roman Polanski film.